Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening to all of you. My name is Chandra. I am the CEO and founder of SecPod Technologies. I am joined by my colleague Satish, who's a chief technology consultant at SecPod. Together, we want to talk about or try and define what truly is prevention. So the end goal of this webinar is being able to clearly articulate what prevention is in a quantifiable, without ambiguity sort of a definition of what prevention is. The need for doing that obviously is there is good amount of clutter and confusion in the industry about cyber attack prevention, and we want to bring some clarity into that as part of this webinar. So this will be part of a series of webinar that we plan to conduct over the next several sessions, with the end goal of being able to come up with a framework for cyber attack prevention, an implementable sort of a framework for organizations to go ahead and implement that as a program to prevent cyber attacks. So that is the purpose of this series of these webinars that we plan to conduct going forward. Satish, a quick introduction from your side.
Yeah, thank you, Chandra. I've been associated with SecPod for over 10 years now, and a large part of my career I have spent in the domain of security. And what I have been focusing now includes not just security from the perspective of how the industry is looking into cybersecurity, and what particularly today's topic has been something I've been thinking about for some time now. And it's high time that we address this issue of what prevention is, how do we technically define prevention, and we would like to give it a shape. Towards the end of these exercises, we would want to come up with a platform that will enable us to clearly identify preventable items in cybersecurity and be able to uh, create a secure environment for organizations. So today we'll spend most of our time talking about the context in which we are setting this, and how we perceive prevention, and how do we define prevention in a quantifiable, practical way, so that we can actually talk about and reason about prevention. So I think Chandra will start the session with some leading slides, and then the slides will come up and I will talk my way through these slides. And hopefully towards the end of this session, we'll have enough time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Satish. Yeah, so these are the items that are part of our agenda today. Obviously, we want to talk about terminology confusion, try and define what is attack surface, try and define what is cyber attack prevention. And if you have any questions during this session, please feel free to message them in the question box. We will attend to each one of them towards the end of the session. So with that, so this is sort of a known thing. Security is an afterthought, as always be an afterthought. Obviously, our primary interest is to build productive systems which kind of deliver according to our need, and security becomes a secondary criteria.
Chandra, I'm not seeing the slides. Are you sharing the slides?
Yes, Satish, I'm on slide 3 right now.
Okay, I'll parallelly see the slides. I'm for some reason not able to see it in the presentation, in the screen.
Let's see.
That's okay.
All right. Yeah, I hope everybody else is able to see. So I'll move forward with that assumption. So the context in which we are talking about security being an afterthought here is that there is over reliance on reactive measures as against proactive measures in the industry. Most of us go with a belief that cyber attacks won't occur, it won't happen to us. And even if it does, there are these detection systems and response systems that are there or available for us to safeguard in the last moment. So that has been the problem, I believe, in the industry, without having paying attention to the prevention or the proactive side of security. Satish, your thoughts on security being an afterthought?
Yeah, it's quite obvious if you spend a minute thinking about how security is built into products. Traditionally, any product that you build, the primary focus is making sure that the product delivers the functionality that it is intended to deliver. Most developers would put their energies into making it work the way they expect it to work, or the customer expects it to work. And uh, perhaps there would be some focus on other QoS like performance, even probably the amount of resources uh, spent in UIs and user experience is going to be a lot more than security, because security does not immediately have an impact on how the product performs. And as we all know, security is something that works against other QoS. It, on the other hand, requires a lot of resources to make sure that the product is secure. Secondly, it also requires that you um, make trade-offs in performance. Security does require you to sacrifice performance, and all these things put together makes it like let's put it aside, because functionality becomes the more important aspect of a product. And typically, security is a dispensable attribute. Most people don't think, and even more importantly, justifying the resources that you spend on security is a bit of a challenge in the industry, or at least has been traditionally a challenge, because to argue that you're spending money on something that you would hope never happen would never happen is a bit of a challenge to argue. And given these, and also the fact that when you're building a product, you don't know how the product is going to be deployed. Its interaction with other products can bring in vulnerabilities or weaknesses that can potentially open up security challenges. And the fact that these things are difficult for you to conceive when you're building a product makes it all that more challenging. And hence, people typically tend to not focus, or had been tending not to focus on security as much. However, I believe things are changing, and I think next slide actually talks a little about how things are changing.
Yeah, certainly. I think more and more, very often these days, I think we are hearing uh, cyber hygiene, proactive security, attack surface management, shift left movement, and zero trust architecture, etc. All with the primary intention being prevention as the kind of focus area. I think most of the organizations and security administrators are realizing the benefit of investing in proactive security as against reactive security. Uh, and that is why we see an increasing trend towards this movement of being able to do everything prior, not just wait for an attackers to come at the doorstep, but how do we actually stop them? How do we actually ensure that they don't have the loopholes or weaknesses to exploit? So that is kind of taking a center stage at this point in time, which is a good trend to see.
I would like to say a couple of words in that context, Chandra.
Please
And
do.
you know the famous adage, right? Stitch in time saves nine, and that applies here as well. Uh, a preventive measure is, in the long run, much less expensive than actually a reactive measure that you would have to take, or even a detection-based security system, because a detection-based security system kicks in only when an attack has been detected or some anomalous behavior has kicked in. And to some extent, damage has already started happening. So, in that context, prevention is a very positive change. It saves a lot of money for the organizations, as well as not having to deal with an event that has actually already started happening versus making sure that the event never happens in the first place is always a good thing. However, in this change, there is one thing one needs to keep in mind. The fact that there is a change happening, and this is not a sudden change. It's been happening gradually, and the industry is realizing that there is a lot more focus that needs to be put into prevention. And when such changes happen, there's bound to be confusion. And uh, in terms of how one thinks about prevention, what is prevention, how would you actually see your activities in terms of are they preventive, are they reactive? So all of these things that you're talking about, uh, for instance, when you say proactive security, in my opinion, and we have been talking about it for some time now, the only proactive security measure that's available to you is prevention. I don't think there is anything else that can be called proactive. Everything else in uh, security measures that you put in place can only be reactive, it cannot be proactive. So when you talk about proactive security, you are really talking about prevention. But what is it that you mean when you say proactive security is what we really need to dive a little deeper into. And of course, all these concepts of what attack surface is, uh, etc., are some things that we will, in the next few slides, clarify. And in the context of prevention, how does attack surface uh, play a role? All of that will become clear as we go through the next few slides.
Certainly, I think we've already started using some of these terms without actually defining proactive security, prevention, attack surface, etc. I think that is where that confusion is there in the industry today. So prevent, protect, detect, defend, etc. Are being interchangeably used. Um, so is there a problem at all if the words are being used interchangeably? I think there is definitely a problem. It doesn't give that clarity that is necessary for anyone to implement a cybersecurity program to safeguard their organization. So, where do I start? What should I invest in? What should I really uh, safeguard, etc.? All of these questions kind of become difficult to answer if you don't have that clarity. So, I've seen in the industry protection, prevention, some of the product vendors who are in the detection layer talking about prevention. So if there is an attack attempt and you stop that attack, uh, for example, is that prevention or is it defend? So that is where I think that this sort of confusion exists, which we want to bring clarity to that confusion today.
So just to elaborate a little further, right? And the word prevent is a very versatile word, and I can very comfortably say that I prevented a major damage to the organization by taking timely action to contain the attack that had been launched. And whereas it really isn't a prevention at all. You have detected something, and your measures against an ongoing attack kicks in, and then you uh, take take appropriate measures to reduce the impact that attack would have. But people continue to use the term "I prevented major damage to the organization." And while nothing of what we mean by prevent is a part of what this would entail. So this is very natural at a time when there is a flux in the industry. The terms that have been used traditionally, where people didn't pay attention to what prevention means, what various ways of defending against a cyber attack would entail, were not clear. So that being the case, the fact that there is this confusion is quite natural. And what we are attempting to do is to bring, and actually, as Chandra, we have been discussing, prevention has a very technical sense in which we can use it, and we can, and as we will see towards the later part of this presentation, that there is a very technical way of defining prevention, and that gives us not only a clear definition, but also gives us a practical way of measuring how much prevention have we actually put in place, or how much preventive action or preventive measures have been put in place in the organization. However, one thing that I would like to clarify right at the beginning is that there are only two types of defense against cybersecurity, the cyber attacks, and that is proactive and reactive. And in my opinion, and I think I can quite well argue and justify this, that the only proactive measure that is available to any security, uh, any cyber security professional is prevention. All the rest of whatever you do is a reactive measure. So that clarity should be there. The fact that there is the only proactive measure that you have available to you is prevention, and the rest of all defenses fall under reactive measure is something that um, I would like to bring forth right at the beginning.
Sure. I think there is one fundamental truth that at least I have been talking about for a while now is every attacker sort of leverages some sort of a weakness that is present in the organization's IT infrastructure to launch attack. And this is a sort of a foundational truth when it comes to cyber attacks per se. Uh, Whether it's a physical form of attack or it is in the attack against the IT infrastructure, I think there's always that weakness that someone is going after, exploiting those weaknesses to launch attacks. Satish, I would like you to probably elaborate on this particular topic.
Yes, and I think this is one of my favorite topics because while we are focusing on cybersecurity, if you look at the larger perspective of any kind of an attack, nobody would nobody would go and hit their heads against a wall. The wall is a very strong structure that you know is not easy to break. Right? And in fact, in ancient times, people used to build forts so that they could defend their whatever territory they had. And that is simply because if you are strong and anyone trying to beat you against your strength, you're not going to you're guaranteed to fail. So this truth applies even in cyber world. People and attackers especially look for weaknesses. They scout for weaknesses. They look for what weaknesses there are in the organization because that is the easiest point of entry for any attacker. Once they gain access to your organization, your system, then doing anything they want to do becomes a lot easier. However, when you have defended yourself, when you have built a fort around your system, to try and penetrate that fort is not going to be easy. So, to take some examples, for instance, uh, and just for a second, if we go outside of cyber attack and look at real attack and take the example of 9/11 or any such event in the world. 9/11, these people spent a lot of time finding out weaknesses in, for instance, how the airports operated, how there were lax security in the airports, and they could penetrate through that simply because that weakness was evident to attackers, and perhaps was ignored by the security agencies, and that let these attackers actually gain access to the system. And then we all know what the consequence was. Now, if on the other hand, it was known that this was a weakness and acknowledged as a weakness, and sufficient attention was paid to strengthen that weakness, such an attack would never have succeeded. And of course, it's easy to talk in hindsight and point out how it could have been prevented. In reality, to foresee this and actually be able to defend it before the attack happens is the challenge. So I think it's almost a tautology to say that attackers leverage weakness. Of course, weakness is a window of opportunity for any attacker, and attackers use these windows to enter the systems. And we need to understand what these windows are, what these weaknesses are. And once we understand these weaknesses, and from there we can start to identify how to strengthen ourselves against these attacks by plugging any loophole or plugging any weakness we have. So if we go to the next slide, Chandra.
Sure. Yeah.
So I did talk about 2611 is uh, 2611 is another attack that happened similarly to 9/11, but in India. And the same thing there again, it was a weakness that wasn't evident to the security organizations, and attackers could gain access to the uh, to the system, to various uh, infrastructures that they could attack. When we think of a cyber attack, this concept of weakness is formalized into something called an attack surface. And what an attack surface is really uh, basically all the weaknesses that are in the system. These weaknesses could be in terms of weaknesses in the software, it could be weaknesses that uh, that are there because of people's behavior. It could be assets that are exposed. There can be misconfigurations. There can be various other factors that are weaknesses. And really, some of all of these uh, put together, if you add up all these various weaknesses, what you come up with is something called an attack surface. Attack surface really gives you a quantifiable way of uh, understanding how exposed your organization is to a cyber attack, any attack. I'm focusing mainly on cyber attack, but what I'm saying can, in fact, be applied equally well to uh, cyber attack, a physical attack, or a hybrid of these two attacks. In that, for instance, many cyber attacks can exploit or do social engineering and uh, gain access to the system by using a combination of cyber and uh, physical uh, uh, physical weaknesses. So while all of those are possible, what we will focus in what follows on only digital attack surface. And what I mean by that is the following. You would, in any organization, you would have a lot of software applications running. There are hardware, many hardware systems are there, and software applications we know have a lot of vulnerabilities. These are potentially an entry point to any cyber attacker. So in hardware, for example, any firmware which in principle could have vulnerabilities that are potentially publicly known and perhaps either patched or patchable or not patchable, we don't know. And at least to the extent that we are able to patch known vulnerabilities, and for those at least that patches exist, hopefully. And today I think the world is moving fast enough in producing patches to known vulnerabilities. Hence, keeping track of the latest patches is a good enough measure. And now you can start to see the relation between vulnerabilities and attack surface, and also vulnerabilities and prevention. In that, if you start to close all these vulnerabilities, you are actually starting to make these windows unavailable to an attacker, which means you are actually preventing an attack taking place at all. So as opposed to these vulnerabilities exist and you have an antivirus system or a detection of some sort that will detect an anomalous behavior, which then becomes a reactive, a detection-based defense, which becomes a reaction to an ongoing attack. And uh, as we alluded to before, such attacks actually such defenses are going to be expensive. When an ongoing attack is detected, the attack has already started and damage has started to happen. Whereas if you have prevented that by actually closing these loopholes, you are you're actually not vulnerable to that, and that will be the thrust of what we're going to talk about. Um,
Yeah,
so in
I
the
think
next
this.
slide, yeah.
Yeah, I think this brings clarity to what attack surface is in an ambiguous way, in my view. So the whole IT infrastructure, if you look at, so you have computing devices, you have network devices, your sensitive data that is present in the environment. There are mission critical, business critical applications that are part of it, and which are probably hosted on the cloud infrastructure. There are those external systems which are exposed to the public internet, etc. So when you holistically look at all of these IT infrastructure elements and understand those loopholes, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities which could be exploited. So I think some of all of these vulnerabilities is nothing but attack surface for organizations or the attackers to exploit. So window of opportunity, as you rightly highlighted here. I think we have that clarity now on what attack surface is. I've also seen in the industry this terminology is being used out of context in many places. I think this kind of brings that clarity in a very unambiguous way, in my view. Over to you,
So,
Satish.
yeah, if you move on to the next slide, I think there are some interesting points I would like to make on that. And I think next slide will actually bring focus on how we can quantify prevention. And I think uh, this slide is very clear in depicting what is prevention versus what is uh, reactive. Now, any activity that you undertake or any measure that you put in place that is before an attack actually happens. For example, you identify various um, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and protect against them. That is what is prevention. And the rest of it becomes detection and responding to an ongoing attack. And often enough, it can be recovering from a system that is completely compromised. But uh, these are the only two types of defenses that exist for cyber attacks. And if you want to quantify prevention, this is how we could start to think about it. Now, before you put some measures in place, you can compute the attack surface, like we pointed out in the previous slide. Attack surface is basically the sum of all the vulnerabilities that exist. Now, when you put some measures in place, for instance, you could put remediation, you could apply software patches for known vulnerabilities. When these things are done, some of the vulnerabilities that existed before the patches were applied, you would definitely see fewer number of vulnerabilities, which means there is a change in the number of vulnerabilities, which in turn results in a reduced attack surface. So simply defined, prevention or the value of preventive um, measure that you've taken can be defined as the attack surface before you implemented these measures minus the attack surface after you implemented these measures. That gives you a very quantitative measure, and it becomes easy conversation to have with the management to say this is how much prevention we can actually do. And of course, you cannot address certain other aspects. And in the next slide, we will come to, and not yet, we will talk about there are certain kinds of vulnerabilities that are not in your control, not in the organization's control, which you cannot, of course, do anything about. Such things are going to still remain, and so attack surface is almost never going to be zero. It's always going to be a positive number. And while the measures that you take can reduce attack surface, any of the measures that you put in place to uh, do a reactive defense, such as detecting an ongoing attack or responding to an attack, etc., is not going to result in a reduced attack surface. It's not going to impact the attack surface. And as such, what we are looking at is very clearly prevention as being an activity or a measure that is going to reduce the attack surface. So this gives us a very clear quantitative way of uh, measuring prevention or measuring the uh, impact of prevention in some sense. So if you go to the next slide, Chandra,
Yes.
and of course, if you have some comments on this slide,
No,
please.
I think you did sum up well. So you're on the next slide now.
Yeah. So what are some of the typical things that are amenable to prevention, or what we defined as preventive measures can be put in place for this? There are uh, uh, things like you have identity privileges, access controls, and all of these things are verified, and only legitimate ones are in the this thing. There are data leakages that can happen into the public domain. Unnecessary ports and services are open to public network. unused computing, uh, vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, unpatched systems, weak encryptions, transport security. I can read through all of this confidential data without encryption or any kind of data that is sensitive that you haven't encrypted, hard-coded credentials, um, and I believe I mentioned weak passwords. Uh, there are um, and even data in motion. There are TLS and other kinds of protocols that are not sufficiently strong. All of these kinds of things, and these are typically what would be considered as contributing to your attack surface. And summing up all of these, and if you look at what is on the left hand side, all of these are in your control. You can actually change and make sure that all of these are taken care of, and uh, any of these that are unpatched or unattended to can be changed, and as such these are what can be prevented. On the other hand, if there are for instance data leakage that's already happened into the public domain, and some adversaries are actually harvesting information about you, or uh, you have uh, opened up ports with little or no access control, and that's already accessible to others. And if attack payload is already delivered and is inside your organization, however, even if no damage is done, that doesn't necessarily say that you can prevent it. Um, when there is an outbound connection to the external network, an exfiltration attempt is happening. And if you have a rather outdated spam message filter, uh, and messages are getting bypassed by that, you might still be vulnerable to that. And brute force attacks are yet another kind where you may have very little control. So it so what I'm trying to convey here is that there are certain class of vulnerabilities that are in your control that falls into the bucket of things that can be prevented, versus there are certain other things that are not in your control and so still is available as vulnerability or attack surface or whatever you want to call it. They are still available to adversaries, attackers who can use them. But uh, what you can do is to prevent those that are preventable. And the way we are proposing to do it will bring an ability to quantify how much you've been able to prevent, and that is what we are uh, trying to do here. So, Chandra, if you would like to say something.
Yeah, I think so. In the context of prevention, what we're trying to say here is all of these are weaknesses and vulnerabilities of different kinds. So if you're able to identify these vulnerabilities and fix those vulnerabilities, shrinking the attack surface, you are in a way preventing cyber attacks. So that is what prevention is all about. On the other side, what it is not is if an attack attempt is already taking place, so which in a way means that some weakness was exploited to conduct that particular attack or launch that particular attack. So you're if you stop that, or if you identify that particular attack scenario and stop it, you're not really preventing it, but you're detecting and responding to that particular situation. So prevention thereby, if you go back to the previous slide, I think we had prevention as a measure to that helps in reducing the attack surface, shrinking the attack surface. So one point that you made, Satish, is that the attack surface can never be eliminated. It can never be zero. So that is where I think the detection and response is still sort of inevitable, but a large percentage of these problems can be avoided. if we were to go ahead and look at vulnerabilities, weaknesses, and security controls, and some of these examples that we gave in the slide here, if we go ahead and address those, I think a good amount of prevention posture can be sort of achieved. Uh,
So
I think so.
in short, I think uh, preventive measures and reactive measures both are complementary to each other. They complement each other. I don't think a complete security system can be built, or a defense can be built and be effective unless both are in place. However, the more you do on the prevention side of it, the more comfortable it is, the less expensive it is, and uh, I and I don't think I can overemphasize the fact that any reactive measure is going to be more expensive than a preventive measure. So that is the value that prevention brings.
Yeah, yeah. I think in a way, what we are seeing is that attack surface is some of all the vulnerabilities and exposures that the IT infrastructure as a whole is subjected to or having these weaknesses. And prevention is all about shrinking those elements to near zero. So attackers have tough job penetrating through to that particular network. Uh, yeah, I think so. Reduction of attack surface, shrinking attack surface to near zero should be the goal of prevention. Whereas reactive security is, in spite of all of these measures, if an attacker were to bypass some of the measure, maybe it is a social engineering attack, somebody were able to convince somebody to give certain uh, confidential information, so then that is something that a tool cannot really help, or a method cannot really help. So that is where I think um, human education, for example, is necessary to address or overcome that particular weakness. Uh, so if you look at it from this particular angle, so we've heard of vulnerability management system, we know SIM and XDR, and so how do we really categorize each of these into what is proactive and what is reactive? So if an organization has to look at implementing a cybersecurity program, so where do they start? Any thoughts on that, Sadish?
In fact, a slightly different thing that I would like to bring up is one of the challenges that most security professionals face is justifying the budget for security. Uh, because, and like I said, most management don't see a reason why money should be spent in doing something uh, or spent on something, hoping that you would never actually have that happen. And this, for example, gives a very quantitative way for justifying the expenses that are involved in doing preventive measures. Uh, so, uh, if you're able to convince the management that by doing this concretely, we are reducing the attack surface. Attack surface, unlike most other things, is a very concrete, very tangible measure. You can actually measure the attack surface. And if you can show that the measures that you have to put in place or that you put in place is going to reduce the attack surface, I think it becomes easy for security professionals to argue with the management and present a case for the budgetary requirements for doing prevention. So sorry, I took you off on a different tangent, but I thought I would emphasize that. I might have mentioned it briefly, but I thought I would mention it again. But can you repeat your question, Chandra, again? Sorry.
No, I think that's a good summary that you presented there. So I was talking more from if an organization has to look at implementing a cybersecurity program. So where do they start? I think right now with the understanding that we sort of presented, so there is proactive security and there is reactive security. That kind of helps simplify where I should start, what are those tools and processes that I must implement to really focus on implementing a good cybersecurity program for the organization. So
So yeah, I think the first step would be to understand the weaknesses. What are the weaknesses in the organization? And once you know the weaknesses, to start to look at how one can build or put in measures that can plug in these weaknesses, uh, would be a good beginning for any cybersecurity program. Because, like we said, attackers look for weaknesses, and it's only through weaknesses that they gain access to the enterprise or the system.
yeah,
You,
that
so that neatly says, identify your weaknesses. The moment you're able to identify your weaknesses, you have done the first step. And once you've identified the weaknesses, the next natural step is to see how you can patch those or build fortifications to ensure that those weaknesses are not there in the system. And that's the beginning of a good security system. And as you rightly pointed out, there are other things that are beyond the control of a security professional or the organization, where somebody is leaking out information and that information is being misused by an adversary. That would be when the reactive measures start to take effect.
yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. But I think the norm in the industry today, unfortunately, is looking at more of detection based reactive security to start with. So I would invest in EDR, XDR, SIM, IDS, IPS, and all kinds of tools to begin with, and then I'll start worrying about hygiene and proactive security. I think definitely what makes sense to is to gain complete visibility into the IT infrastructure and really start the cybersecurity program from the weakness point of view. Understand the weaknesses, eliminate those weaknesses before attackers have the opportunity to exploit those weaknesses. That is where a formidable security posture can be established, in my view. I think you rightly said, starting with weaknesses.
Right.
All right. Any final thoughts from you, Satish?
Yeah, as we began this webinar, right, we said our goal is to start to do a series of these webinars, not just as a knowledge sharing thing, but provide a practical way of doing these things. And our goal still remains that. What we would like to do is to, at least our final goal should and is to build a platform that clearly delineates what is what is prevention, build a platform uh, that can provide you easy way of identifying these weaknesses, patching them, making sure that attack surfaces can be visibly reduced in a systematic and a comprehensive way. That is our final goal. And this is only the beginning, and I think this is the first of the series, and we have a long way to go before we come to a point where we say we have this platform available. And I would like to see that happen soon.
Certainly, I think that is definitely the direction that we have taken. So with the series of these coming up in the next over a period of time, I think we should be able to present sort of an implementable framework for preventing cyber attacks. So with that, I think we have come to the end of this webinar. At SecPod, we've been building a platform for preventing cyber attacks with the same principle that we presented today. If you would like to try out the platform, secpod.com is where you would go and sign up yourself. Pretty easy to sign up and onboard yourself. Thank you all for being part of this webinar today. With that, we would like to conclude this session. Looking forward to the next one's part of the series. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day, Satish.
You too, Chandra.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.